Mitch Jeserich. Last week, we did a program concerning the rise of attacks and harassment against Asian Americans over the span of the COVID-19 pandemic. We mentioned that there are two measures on California Governor Gavin Newsom's desk meant to, at least start to, address this in a state where just over half of all hate incidents are reported in the country. Governor Newsom signed both measures into law. The first is to create a study concerning harassment on public transportation. The second is to incentivize businesses to create an environment where such incidents are less likely to happen. I say hate incidents to distinguish between hate crimes because not everything rises to the level of a hate crime. Well, today we are going to be in conversation about how this rise in hate incidents over the last couple of years is not actually new, but a theme we see in U.S. history going all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. But we're also going to be in conversation about how people fought back against it and how people continue to fight back against it. My guest for this is Catherine Ceniza Choi. Catherine Ceniza Choi is a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and she is the author of the book that we are going to be in conversation about. It's called Asian American Histories of the United States. Professor Choi, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
I'm pleased to have you. I'd like to begin with the term Asian American. I think many people may just assume this is a descriptive box on a census form, but there's a deep history to the term Asian American itself. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate you beginning by saying that today we might take the term Asian American for granted as a kind of label of identification on a government form, or to generally refer to an American with Asian ancestry. But before it became this more mainstream kind of term, it had a very specific and unique history that emerges in the late 1960s out of social movements and student protests. And it originated in Berkeley. It was created by two graduate students, Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka, who helped found the Asian American Political Alliance, which was an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist organization. And so the term Asian American has a history that's one of political sensibility, a solidarity with other racialized groups in the United States, but also with decolonization and independence movements throughout the world. And the term speaks to a history which was really a watershed, a break from the past. I mean, prior to this moment, the late 1960s, most people would refer to what we now call, Asian Americans as Orientals, primarily.
That was the term before. I certainly remember sometimes older people still use the term Oriental.
Yes, so there's a generational, aspect to the term. But the problem with the Orientals is that it, as a term, speaks to the commodification and the perpetual foreignness of Asian Americans. So it smacks of like Oriental rugs and Oriental vases. And there's always that orientation from outside of the United States. Again, sort of being grounded in that stereotype of a perpetual foreigner and non-American. And if it wasn't Oriental, it would be oftentimes a pejorative term or a slur, such as quote unquote Jap during World War II, or Gook, or something like Asiatic, which again was speaking to their non-Americanness, their foreignness, and often their the perception of Asian Americans as as a threat, an outside threat to the United States. So it was really quite radical to be able to name oneself, for Asian Americans to name oneself and claim their Americanness, but also their Asian ancestry. So there's a lot going on in the history of that term.
I think a lot of people may be surprised who are unfamiliar with that history that, again, the term Asian American was connected to anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist politics.
Yes, and I think that has to do with a misperception and misunderstanding of Asian Americans as being apolitical, which is one strand of another common stereotype of being a model minority, and not speaking up and not speaking out. And that was certainly not the case when one studies the history of this term, Asian American, and the unique aspects of its politics and its identity and its solidarity. And there's so many things that came out of it, curricular innovations, community service organizations, a more dignified approach to the representation of Asians and Asian Americans in arts and culture, which we still contend with today, but we may take these kinds of issues for granted. But they were created out of a time and a place, and it was an idea that caught on. I mean, not solely in the San Francisco Bay Area, but certainly, across the United States. And one of the ways we kind of most visibly see it is through Asian American studies programs and departments in universities and colleges, but also in so many different Asian American centered service organizations.
So along with Asian American, we have African American, we have Native American. Are these terms, are they all coming from the same place and time? Is there a connection?
There is a connection. The student strikes of 1968, beginning at San Francisco State College, as it was known then, and then beginning in early 1969 at UC Berkeley, these were student strikes that involved Asian Americans who were involved in and in solidarity with the Black Student Union at San Francisco State, with the Third World Liberation Front. And so these terms that you mentioned, they do share a connection. They share comparatively, some similar experiences, but it's also important to understand the distinctiveness and uniqueness. But they all share also a relationship, like a historical relationship of coming together. And one of the demands that I was referring to regarding Asian American Studies programs, that was certainly shared across these various groups, about the need to have a more inclusive and relevant educational curriculum, and overall institutions need to be mindful of the communities in which they live and serve.
What was the Third World Liberation Front?
Well, the Third World Liberation Front is a term to refer to this solidarity of various groups, again, with their unique histories. I mean, some of this includes organizations like PACE, which I talk about in the book, which was the Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor, or the Mexican American Student Union. And they confronted their uniqueness, but also their common objectives. in terms of not only wanting an inclusive curriculum, but also broader ideas, things like liberation for racialized peoples here in the United States, but also colonized peoples throughout the world. So the idea of the third world is one that is connecting the struggles of racialized and sometimes considered minoritized groups in the United States. But when one looks at a global framework, how this is such a large group when one thinks of those transnational or trans-Pacific and international connections.
Is this part of the strike for ethnic studies in 1968 at San Francisco State University?
Yes, it is. It is, and it's a history in which participants were making these connections between their everyday experiences, being a person of color in a San Francisco Bay Area community, but again, also making that connection on broader scales to national as well as global ones.
Can you tell me about Amy Uematsu and the term yellow power?
So I write about Amy Uematsu in the book and how the term yellow power became popular in during this time period, late 1960s, early 1970s, and reflected in that phrase, yellow power, is a reference to Black power and how influential the Black freedom struggle and the Black Panthers were to the Asian American movement and really the pioneers of Asian America. So it's a relationship and it's a reflection of that solidarity and how much the Black power was influential, both in terms of its substance and style for the Asian American movement and its activists at the time. But I also confront some of the tensions in the Asian American movement, also emerging during that time. And one of those tensions surrounds the use of the term yellow and how yellow can refer to and center specific East Asian American groups in the conception of Asian America, and how some Asian American activists were Filipino, and certainly today Filipino, South Asian, Vietnamese American, and who would identify more as brown Asians and felt some marginalization from these umbrella pan-ethnic categories. So those kinds of terms like yellow power are, I think, really important to reflect some of the coalition building and the relational aspects, especially with the Black American experience. But then also speak to the fragility also of terms like Asian American.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind the diversity of the Asian American community. Even in the makeup of the Third World Liberation Front, you have several different Asian organizations: the Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor, Asian American Political Alliance, and the Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, who are all part of that larger Third World Liberation Front coalition.
Yes, and there are also a number of Japanese American activists as well. And even though they had this common objective, which was one of the objectives, was to have the broader public, as well as the educational institutions, acknowledge Asian American histories, and that they were unique from the unjust incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II on the US West Coast without due process, to the lack of knowledge about Filipino American labor organizing throughout the first half of the 20th century into the second half, and the importance of labor organizers like Larry Itliong, who played foundational roles in the creation of the United Farm Workers, or UFW. So even though these histories are very unique, these different groups of Asian Americans came together to protest and to resist the ignorance and erasure of these histories.
Of course, the late 1960s is a very fascinating political moment in this country's history. You have all kinds of things going on, including major wars in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. You have anti-war movement, Black Power movement, Asian American movement. It's kicking off everywhere. For Asian Americans, what are Asian American activists in this period of time responding to?
Oh, they're responding to a number of things. I had mentioned some of the ignorance regarding Japanese American internment during World War II, as well as Filipino American labor organizing. But in addition to that, there were many issues shared by various groups, from employment discrimination, which was an outgrowth really of 19th as well as early 20th century social discrimination, labor discrimination against various groups of Asian Americans. They were responding to harassment and bullying in their childhood experience, which seems mundane, but is a collective shared experience of non-belonging, and which tragically persists today in our age of COVID-19. So there were so many different issues. You brought up the important event, which is really a theme about U.S. participation in wars in Asia, and how this impacts Asian American communities here in the United States. There were Asian American war veterans, but who at the time were on the ground in Vietnam, and who testified that they were being used as examples of what the enemy looked like. And that kind of psychological terror or trauma of being literally mistaken for the quote unquote enemy. And so the Vietnam War was one of these formative moments for Asian American consciousness. At this point by the late 1960s, television is becoming a much more mainstream, or has become already a much more mainstream medium. And so seeing these visual images of the U.S. military in Vietnam and seeing the suffering of Vietnamese people, who many Asian Americans looked at and saw themselves and their relatives reflected in these faces, raised this consciousness, a racial consciousness about what the United States government was doing there, but also in terms of overall self-liberation. And that actually goes back to your initial question about this unique history of the term Asian American and what this could mean for Asian Americans during the Vietnam War. I think to claim both an American identity, but specifically Asian American identity, is about confronting racial oppression and injustice, which wars can bring out in very powerful ways.
Probably can't understate the significance of these wars. And again, I mentioned Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. The latter two were more at the time considered secretive wars. But I left out Korea just the decade before in the Korean War. And when I start thinking about it, I was like, well, it's probably very much in this period of time, very much like how we've seen in the last 2 decades concerning the United States and Muslim countries, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, I even keep thinking about that. Afghanistan is technically in Asia, as is, I think, the Middle East as well. So, and if we just sort of think about that, our relationship to the Muslim world right now in U.S., I guess, imperialism, it's very much not so dissimilar to what was probably happening in the middle of the 20th century.
Well, there's certainly these connections and relations between various U.S. wars. We could, go back to the Spanish-American War, which is more well known in terms of the United States and Cuba, but also took place in the Philippines and led to U.S. colonization of the Philippines, and then the Philippine-American War at the turn of the century, because Filipino independence activists and nationalists wanted their independence from Spain, and they didn't necessarily want another colonizer, being the United States, to come in. We've talked just briefly about World War II. You mentioned the Korean War, Vietnam, and how U.S. participation in Vietnam also led to participation in more secret, and actually it was called that or labeled that, secret war in Laos, and bombings in both Laos and Cambodia. And then you bring up more recent issues like our military presence in Afghanistan. And one of the ways that it has impacted Asian Americans has been its racialization, especially of members of the South Asian American community, stereotyped and being and racialized as terrorists. And as enemies of the state. So again, this goes back to that. It's a connection with how so many Asian Americans felt racialized as a quote unquote gook, a subhuman, and as an enemy of the United States during the Vietnam War. So there are these connections between international, transnational events and how Asian Americans are treated here in the United States. And you mentioned, I just wanted to say this, even though I wrote about it, I think more so in a general sense in the book, which is that when you brought up Middle East, for the Middle East, for example, and its relationship to Asia and Asian Americans. One of the things about the term Asian American is that it's a pan-ethnic umbrella term that is encompassing this incredible, geographic, cultural, historical diversity. And there are some Asian Americans who view this as, in some ways, limiting, who don't necessarily feel seen in that umbrella term. And I think there are conversations today about pushing the boundaries of that term to be more inclusive of South Asian American, Middle Eastern experiences. And so while it is a term that is rooted in a specific time, beginning in the late 1960s, it's also one that is a living history, that is dynamic, that is continually talked about. And so approaching this book, I mean, part of the reason why I titled it Asian American Histories was in the plural, was in large part to acknowledge that dynamic and that diversity, and to also approach these histories with a sense of humility, to acknowledge that they're growing and changing, literally as I wrote and as we speak.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Catherine Ceniza Choi. She is the author of the book that we are in conversation about, called Asian American Histories of the United States. Catherine Ceniza Choi is also a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Looking at, and as I mentioned in my introduction, during the span of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a rise in hate incidents towards Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in this country. You write in your book, Asian American Histories of the United States, this is actually not a new phenomenon when it comes to our response to disease and illness. Tell me about that.
Well, this has just been such a difficult, devastating and traumatic time for Asian Americans in our age of COVID-19, and how since 2020, Asian American communities have been confronting really a dual existential crisis, which is about a deadly disease and also about the surge in anti-Asian hate and violence. As an Asian American historian, one of the things I've learned from Asian American history is that this scapegoating of Asians and Asian American bodies as disease carriers, and blaming us for this deadly disease is not new. It has a history that is about 150 years old, goes back to the second half of the 19th century, when so many different diseases, smallpox, cholera, bubonic plague, diseases and their outbreaks would be blamed on various groups of Asian migrants to the United States, from Chinese to Japanese to South Asian pioneering migrants during that time and into the early 20th century. And even during that earlier period, those groups of Asian Americans were aware of how serious this was, because once you become labeled as a disease carrier, you become objectified and dehumanized, and that dehumanization lends itself to acts of violence against you. And so themes of being associated with disease and danger and the concurrent spikes in anti-Asian violence is a pattern that we can see even from over 100 years ago. Now, these forms of violence, come in many different forms. With the Chinese, the oldest mass migration of Asian Americans to the United States, beginning in the second half of the 19th century, forms of violence involving expulsion, arson, the burning down of Chinatowns, lynching, shooting, stabbing, so many different forms of violence arise from a number of things. One is labor competition or economic competition with white European working classes. But that is also interwoven into stereotypical associations, and those associations with disease and filth and being a kind of peril or danger to literally the health of the United States is one that we can see from a long time ago, and how it's been experienced among so many different Asian American groups. And it's not until more recently, 2015, where the WHO, the World Health Organization, asked all of us to stop naming and labeling diseases and associating them with people, countries, economies, because of the stigma and the resultant harassment and shunning of that particular group. And I think what's been difficult for Asian American historians, Asian American studies scholars, is observing how this history is repeating itself in our current moment. We've made quite a bit of progress in terms of establishing Asian American studies programs and ethnic studies programs to combat some of these stereotypes, but it is clear that there is so much more we need to do to point out that this kind of racial and medical scapegoating against Asian Americans hurts not solely Asian Americans, but all of us.
I want to stay with the second half of the 19th century, sort of the later 1800s, because it feels like this is a very important period of time in which, as you mentioned, Asians in this country, and this is really a West Coast story that we're talking about. This isn't the Deep South. The city of San Francisco, the San Francisco Board of Health, called Chinatown a health threat. And the city I was born, a small town at the time, Antioch, in 1876, drove out the residents of its Chinatown just off of the Delta. That was actually connected to allegations of a sexually transmitted disease. This is the time when we get the passage of the Page Act that I want to ask you about what that was. And this is also a time in which we literally see lynchings of dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of especially Asian, especially Chinese people on the West Coast during this period of time. So can we stick there for a moment here and talk to me more about the significance of the late 1800s?
Yes, absolutely.
I threw a lot out there, so.
Yeah, well, one of the things you mentioned was the passage of the 1875 Page Act. And so let me begin there. That's one of many laws that are passed in the second half of the 19th century, targeting um, Asian migrants. And in this case, it has a gendered component. Specifically, one of its targets um, was Asian women. And so the passage of the 1875 Page Act was about trying to exclude the passage of unfree laborers to the United States, but also women and people coming in under the for immoral purposes, and I'm immoral purposes in quotes because that's actually the phrase. But the way it was enforced was targeting Asian women, and even more specifically, Chinese women at ports in Asia before coming to the United States, where they had to, Chinese women would have to prove that they were not prostitutes. And so what this does is it creates this, it justifies this preconception of Chinese and by extension Asian women as women of immoral purposes, and contributes to their commodification as sexual objects, their exoticization, themes that we continue again to see in our more present day. But those kinds of stereotypes are created by the passage and implementation and attempted enforcement of such laws. So that's one example of what is happening during this time period that is constructing the Asian, the Chinese immigrant as a non-American, an outsider, and as a threat to the United States. You brought up a number of things, but you brought up lynching. And lynching is a particular kind of violence. It's one that is meant to inflict both physical as well as psychological terror. Certainly more well known for important historical reasons in connection to the African American experience in the South during this time period, but was also a mode of violence that was used against other racialized groups in the U.S. West, including the Chinese. So in 1871, there was a massacre in Chinatown in Los Angeles, in which approximately 17 Chinese men were lynched. And this comes out of a history in our state, which in which this kind of violence is justified by one of the things you brought up, which is public health measures, which tragically resulted in stereotypical associations with Asians and disease. And as I pointed to earlier, but it's worth emphasizing again, that kind of association dehumanizes people and can seemingly justify these egregious forms of violence when it's counterproductive. We do have this history that's uncomfortable to face in the state of California and places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, where the creation of our public health departments were certainly not immune to racial stereotyping. And I'm, you know, I want to point that out in part because it is really difficult to criticize public health and medicine because of the important humanitarian and caring work that they do. And at the same time, there are these very specific histories about how even these kinds of institutions can perpetuate stereotypes about groups of people that lead to violence. And I think confronting these kinds of conundrums and contradictions is important moving forward.
Yeah, there is the quarantine of Chinatown in I think it's 1910 with the outbreak of bubonic plague. Chinatown was scapegoated for that. We see this notion of in the first half of the 20th century, yellow peril in the first half of the 20th, I think perpetuated like such as of Oakland's favorite writer, Jack London. And then, but it's not just this ancient history this is not ancient history, obviously. This isn't just 19th century.
But it is from over a century ago, and so there are a number of people who probably think of it that way.
Well, we do shows on ancient history, so I don't want to confuse anything here. But it's not like this is something that happens late 19th century, early 20th century, and then suddenly arises again here with the COVID-19 pandemic. You're right that we see an uptake in hate incidents in the 1980s and 90s too. What's happening then?
Well, there are a number of disease outbreaks. I mean, one of the most well-known was related to SARS, which had geographic associations with East Asia. And so even then, there was concern and legitimate concern that there was an uptick in anti-Asian harassment and hate incidents. And so you're right, this is something that I point out in the book, that what is happening is not new, and that we see different kinds of iterations of this association and how it leads to harassment and violence against, in this case, Asian Americans. You know, the difference with SARS is that it didn't have the kind of it didn't appear to the extent that COVID-19 did in the United States, in every state, and leading to so many different ways we have changed our lives over the past 2 years. And so there's been an intensity that we have experienced and continue to experience in the present day. And you know, I was saying this earlier, that it's difficult to confront these things, and yet it is important in order to move forward. And if it's one, you know, hopeful or perhaps positive thing that might emerge from this pandemic, is so many of us are thinking about, you know, how do we want to live our lives? What kind of world and California and United States of America, what kind of place do we want to live in?
One final question about the late 1800s here, because I think it's important. And we began our conversation talking about what was happening in the late 1960s, sort of Black Asian unity and coalitions, creation of the Third World Liberation Front. What's fascinating, and I learned this from your book in the late 1800s, is Frederick Douglass actually spoke in defense of Asians and what was
Yes,
happening to Asians.
yes. So in the book, I point out that there is this solidarity between Black Americans and Asian Americans that we see during the late 1960s and early 1970s. For example, with the student strikes at San Francisco State College and at UC Berkeley, but that this solidarity between these groups has a much longer history. And in the second half of the 19th century, when we saw this uptick in intense anti-Chinese sentiment, hate incidents, and violence, the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass gave a speech in 1869 when that anti-Chinese sentiment was already quite high. And he publicly supported Chinese immigration to the United States while there were calls for their exclusion and expulsion. And he also called for their naturalization to gain a fuller sense of belonging through citizenship.
And this is exactly the opposite of what's actually happening in that country. It's restricting citizenship away from.
Yes, well, right. I mean, our country has a longer history even of that of restricting U.S. citizenship, but yes, I mean, it was moving towards trying to exclude Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States altogether, and especially with Chinese laborers. That was codified with the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and was renewed for decades until the early 1940s, only until international events with China being allies of the United States during World War II sort of changing that mode of immigration restriction and exclusion. So it's really quite an extraordinary moment for Frederick Douglass to say those things. And I point this out and give other examples through the 20th century to point out that Black and Asian American solidarity is certainly not a new phenomenon.
Catherine Choi, I want to go back to something you said earlier because I think it was important, and I didn't mean it to go by without further commenting on, and that was the trauma that Asian American communities are experiencing right now. I live just a block from Oakland's Chinatown, and it's something that I have firsthand have seen how it has affected Oakland's Chinatown for as long as I've lived in Oakland, which is a good 25 years now. Was always a bustling street. It was hard to get down the street sometimes because there'd be so many people out there and produce and everything out. It'd take a minute to get down the street. There's there's probably other reasons too, but there's just not as many people as there used to be. You see shops closing early because they're scared of being open after like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. We also see and of course that has economic devastation on what is a historic Chinatown. Doesn't get the attention that San Francisco's does, but it is a historic Chinatown. And, I mean, just as an outsider who lives nearby, I have seen a community in trauma.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Mitch, because I think so many of us, Asian Americans, non-Asian Americans who live, work, or have visited these either ethnic enclaves or Asian American businesses have observed these changes or have interacted with Asian Americans and have heard stories about their own experiences with anti-Asian um, sentiment, and if not direct hate and violence, but also the fear and anxiety that what has been happening has engendered in so many of us. And it really is painful, and it's so counterproductive. There are Asian Americans who are health workers and who are frontline workers who are contributing to our overall, American experience and our communities in many different ways. And oftentimes in history, we talk about like the big events and um, uh, specific names of leaders and founders. But it is important to remember that these histories are about all of us on the ground, trying to survive this pandemic, and with the hope of thriving. And we can't get there without the well-being of Asian Americans.
I have heard from a couple of people within the community basically say that they feel like the pain and what they're going through right now is almost invisible to the entire nation. And I wonder, and I think about the left and the progressive community on this, and if the response is, I disagree with anything I say. I feel it has been a bit muted, and not entirely muted, but maybe muffled would be a better word. And I get why there are concerns about, we don't want to bring pro-policing. We don't want to sound like we want more policing of the community. We don't want to strengthen the prison pipeline. We don't want others driving wedges through certain communities. And I get all of that, but I kind of feel like we have left a vacuum to sort of more of the pro-policing, more of these things that we don't want to enforce to fill. Because when I go through Chinatown now, there's a heavy police presence. And most people are there, honestly, are pretty happy that they're there. I think they feel a sense of relief that they are there. And I wonder if we have left a vacuum and not providing potential alternatives, or at least just talking about it more.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for sharing all those nuanced insights. One of the main themes in my book is the theme of erasure of Asian American histories, and how historically, and even to the present day, we can see this erasure in the form of the invisibility that so many Asian Americans feel in our national or even our state and community discourse, as well as representation in particular places, whether it's in the workplace or other kinds of institutions. And there has been at least one study pointing out that a significant percentage, like about at least a third of Americans, don't think that anti-Asian violence, as it's been experienced the past couple of years, is an issue. So that compounds the pain and trauma that I was referring to. It's already one thing to feel fear and anxiety going out with the understanding that you could be the next target of a hate incident or hate crime by the way you look and the way in which your group has been associated with this disease. And then it's another thing to feel as though you can't talk about it. Or if you talk about it, it's going to be ignored or dismissed as, oh, not as important as other issues. It's a really one of the very basic things that we could do is just include Asian Americans in these conversations, to listen to their experiences, from Asian American business owners to Asian American health workers and other frontline uh, employees, and to just include that and center that. Instead, I think what is happening in terms of what you're describing with this notion that, well, if I bring up this issue, it signifies pro-policing or it signifies something else. It isn't necessarily like that. I mean, Asian Americans are a very diverse group in so many ways. And one of the ways they're diverse is in terms of political sensibility. And they're arranged. Not all Asian Americans are pro-police, one way, or another. So I think before we assume, or our legislators assume, that acknowledging and including Asian Americans in the conversation is not necessarily signifies support for an issue, the better served we are. And in fact, when you ignore Asian American voices, it just makes it worse. I really think we would have more alternatives to lessening the fear and anxiety and increasing feelings of protection and security if we listen to Asian Americans on the ground in places like Oakland, Chinatown, because there are other alternatives to increased policing that we would learn about, whether it's community, sort of self-help organizations, providing support for elderly residents of the place, or what would help businesses the most. I think asking these open-ended questions and listening to the range of alternatives would be really beneficial for all of us.
Catherine Ceniza Choi has been our guest. She is the author of the book that we've been in conversation about, called Asian American Histories of the United States. Catherine Ceniza Choi is also a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Choi, I thank you for taking this time to join me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you.